May 19th, 2021. Nursing student Alayna Hardy
made a 911 call that should have saved her life.
30 minutes later, she was dead. But here's what makes this case so disturbing. Everyone saw it coming. The neighbors, the police, even the courts. The red flags weren't subtle whispers. They were screaming alarms. So, how does a 27-year-old woman who did everything right, who followed every rule, who called for help when she needed it most, how does she end up murdered in her own apartment? What happened in those 30 minutes? And why did every system designed to protect her fail when it mattered most? This is the story of Alayna Hardy and the warning signs that could save your life. In 2015, Alayna Hardy packed her dreams and headed from Arizona to New York City. At 27, she was determined to make something of herself, specifically to become a physician's assistant. The bustling streets of Manhattan were a far cry from Arizona, but Alayna embraced the change with the kind of infectious enthusiasm that drew people to her instantly. She found an apartment on East 115th Street and First Avenue in East Harlem. Not the fanciest neighborhood, but it was hers. The fourth-floor apartment became her sanctuary as she threw herself into her studies at Hunter College, working toward her nursing degree as a stepping stone to her bigger dreams. Alayna had the magnetic personality that made her instantly likable. Friends described her as kind, compassionate, and driven. The type of person who lit up rooms with her energy and smile. She shared moments of joy on social media, showing a young woman who was truly embracing life in the big city. Then she met Fernando Munera. It happened the way these things often do, a chance encounter in their shared apartment building. Fernando lived on the first floor, Alayna on the fourth. He was 26, charming in that initial way that draws you in before you see what's underneath. Their meeting seemed like fate, the kind of coincidence that feels romantic in the beginning. What started as casual conversations in the hallway quickly blossomed into something more intense. Fernando was passionate, attentive, seemingly smitten with this vibrant woman who'd moved across the country to chase her dreams. To Alayna, who was building a new life in an unfamiliar city, his attention felt like validation and connection. Their relationship moved fast, the kind of whirlwind romance that feels exciting when you're living it. Friends and neighbors saw them together often, walking their dog, riding Fernando's motorcycle, appearing close and inseparable. In December 2020, Alayna posted a photo of herself smiling alongside Fernando, capturing what seemed like happier times. But even in those early days, there were whispers of something not quite right. Fernando's personality had an edge to it, what some would later describe as macho behavior. He was possessive in ways that might have seemed romantic at first, but were actually warning signs of what was to come. He had opinions about how Alayna should dress, who she should talk to, how she should spend her time. Here's the first red flag that should have stopped everything. Fernando sought to control aspects of Alayna's life from the very beginning. He would call her repeatedly, send unwanted text messages, and try to dictate her appearance, even when she was away on vacation. What might have looked like caring attention was actually the early stages of systematic control. The second red flag was equally subtle but just as dangerous: their living situation. When you're dating someone who lives in the same building, there's no real escape, no going home to your own space to think clearly, no physical distance to help you see the relationship objectively. Fernando could monitor Alayna's comings and goings, knew when she was home, could show up whenever he wanted. This proximity that seemed so convenient, so romantic, was actually creating a perfect storm. Alayna was isolated in a new city, dependent on a relationship that was beginning to show cracks, living just 3 floors away from someone whose behavior was becoming increasingly concerning. But like so many women in the early stages of an abusive relationship, Alayna couldn't see the pattern forming. The controlling behavior felt like love. The jealousy seemed like passion. The constant contact looked like devotion. She had no way of knowing that she was living in the same building as the man who would eventually kill her. That the romance she thought was the best part of her new life in New York was actually the beginning of a nightmare that would end in tragedy. The perfect storm was already brewing, and Alayna Hardy was caught right in the center of it. By early 2021, the Fernando Munera that Alayna had fallen for was disappearing, replaced by someone much darker and more dangerous. What neighbors witnessed was a man whose personality had shifted dramatically, and the catalyst was chilling in its simplicity. prescription painkillers mixed with alcohol. Fernando had been in a motorcycle accident that left him with lingering pain and a prescription for powerful painkillers. What started as legitimate medical treatment became something far more sinister when he began mixing those medications with alcohol. Neighbor Noel Enrique Bermudez watched the transformation happen in real time. His personality changed after he began mixing prescription painkillers with alcohol, Bermudez later recalled. The man who had once seemed charming and attentive was becoming erratic, unpredictable, and increasingly aggressive. This was red flag number 3, and it was massive. Substance abuse that fundamentally altered Fernando's behavior and decision-making. When someone you're in a relationship with starts mixing prescription drugs with alcohol, their capacity for rational thought, emotional regulation, and impulse control becomes severely compromised. What Alayna was seeing wasn't just mood swings. It was chemical-induced personality changes that made Fernando exponentially more dangerous. But the substance abuse was just amplifying what was already there. Fernando's controlling behavior, which had started as seemingly romantic attention, was escalating into something much more sinister. He began dictating what Alayna could wear, not suggesting, not expressing preferences, dictating. He would criticize her clothing choices, demand she change, make her feel self-conscious about her appearance. This wasn't a boyfriend with opinions. This was a man who believed he had the right to control how his girlfriend presented herself to the world. Even more disturbing, Fernando would answer Alayna's phone for her. Think about how invasive that is. Your phone is your personal connection to the outside world, and Fernando was intercepting that connection, controlling who could reach Alayna and how those conversations went. He was systematically isolating her from her support network. Red flag number 4. When someone starts controlling your communication with others, they're not being protective. They're being possessive. They're cutting off your lifelines to people who might help you see the relationship clearly. Friends noticed that Alayna was becoming increasingly isolated. Fernando would make her cut off friendships with other people, particularly anyone he perceived as a threat to his control. This is classic abuser behavior, systematically removing the victim's support system so they become more dependent on the abuser. The neighbors in their East Harlem building were starting to notice Fernando's behavior too. He would pace outside the building, muttering to himself, displaying the kind of agitated energy that made people uncomfortable. Red flag number 5. The relentless monitoring and communication demands. When someone calls you dozens of times in a single day, sends constant text messages, demands to know where you are and what you're doing every moment, that's not love. That's surveillance. That's control disguised as caring. The weekend before Alayna's murder, Fernando called her more than 80 times. 80 times in one weekend. That's not someone missing their girlfriend. That's someone who has completely lost the ability to respect boundaries or accept that another person has the right to space and independence. But perhaps the most dangerous red flag was one that friends and family should have recognized. Fernando's escalating anger when Alayna tried to assert any independence. Every time she pushed back against his control, every time she tried to maintain friendships or make her own decisions, Fernando's rage would intensify. Madison Elder, Alayna's cousin who considered herself Alayna's best friend, later said that Fernando was a classic abuser. The signs were all there. The isolation tactics, the communication control, the possessive monitoring, the substance abuse fueling increasingly erratic behavior. The mask had completely slipped. The charming man Alayna had met in their apartment building was revealed to be a controlling, substance-abusing, increasingly violent individual who saw Alayna not as a partner, but as property to be controlled. And the most terrifying part? They were still living in the same building, just 3 floors apart. Every day Alayna had to navigate life knowing that her abuser was always nearby, always watching, always ready to escalate his control tactics. The storm was intensifying, and Alayna was running out of safe harbor. February 2021 was when Fernando Munera's mask didn't just slip, it shattered completely. What happened in Alayna's apartment that month would expose the true danger she was living with, just 3 floors above her abuser. The incident was brutal in its calculated cruelty. Fernando didn't just lose his temper, he systematically terrorized Alayna in her own home. He held her down, restraining her as she tried to escape his rage. While she curled up on her bed in a defensive position, trying to protect herself, Fernando began throwing glass bottles of cosmetics at her. Each throw was deliberate, designed to frighten and humiliate. But Fernando wasn't finished. He moved through Alayna's apartment like a hurricane, throwing items around, destroying her belongings, asserting his dominance over her space. The psychological message was clear. Nowhere was safe from him, not even her own home. He broke 2 interior doors, physical barriers that represented her attempts to create boundaries, literally smashed to pieces. The most chilling detail, Fernando seized Alayna's phone to prevent her from calling for help. This wasn't a moment of passion. This was strategic. He knew that taking her phone would cut off her ability to reach anyone who might intervene. It was the act of someone who understood exactly what he was doing and wanted to ensure no one could stop him. When police finally responded, Fernando was arrested and charged with unlawful imprisonment, harassment, and criminal mischief. The evidence was overwhelming. The destroyed apartment, Alayna's injuries, the clear pattern of domestic violence. Here was a man who had literally held a woman prisoner in her own home. The legal system did what it was supposed to do. A restraining order was issued, prohibiting Fernando from contacting Alayna. On paper, she was protected. The law had stepped in to create a barrier between victim and abuser. But here's where the first massive system failure occurred, one that would ultimately cost Alayna her life. When prosecutors tried to hold Fernando on bail, pointing to his documented history of domestic violence incidents, the judge released him on his own recognizance. Despite multiple previous reports, despite the clear escalation of violence, despite the obvious danger he posed, Fernando walked free. Why? Because New York state law prohibited judges from factoring dangerousness into their bail decisions. The law was designed to prevent people from sitting in jail simply because they couldn't afford bail, but it had an unintended consequence. Violent domestic abusers were being released back into the community to continue terrorizing their victims. Domestic violence expert Dorshan Leidholt later said, "If ever there was a case in which bail should have been granted, it's this case. Had that happened, Alayna Hardy very likely would be alive today." The restraining order gave Alayna a false sense of security. It was a piece of paper that said Fernando couldn't contact her, couldn't come near her, couldn't threaten her. But restraining orders only work if the person they're issued against respects the law. For someone like Fernando, someone whose behavior was escalating, whose substance abuse was making him increasingly unpredictable, whose obsession with control was overriding his rational judgment, that piece of paper was meaningless. May 19th, 2021 started like any other evening for Alayna Hardy. She was in her 4th-floor apartment, probably studying or relaxing after another day pursuing her nursing dreams. But at 8:15 p.m., her world exploded into chaos. Fernando was on her fire escape. Despite the restraining order, there he was, outside her window, violating every protection the law had promised her. Alayna did exactly what she was supposed to do. She called 911. It was a clear, straightforward report. Alayna wasn't hysterical or confused. She knew exactly who was threatening her. She knew he was breaking the law, and she was asking for the protection she had been promised. The 911 dispatcher took the information and sent officers from Manhattan's 25th precinct to respond. Here's where the second catastrophic system failure occurred, one that would haunt everyone involved for years to come. The police arrived, took a report, and left. They didn't find Fernando, who had fled on his motorcycle when he saw them coming. More critically, they didn't stay to ensure Alayna's safety. They didn't post anyone to watch the building. They didn't escort her to a safe location. They didn't treat this as the life-threatening emergency it clearly was. Remember, this was the same precinct where Alayna had filed 6 previous domestic violence reports against Fernando. These officers knew his history. They knew about the February incident. They knew about the restraining order. They knew he was dangerous, but they took a report and drove away, leaving Alayna alone in an apartment building where her abuser had already demonstrated he could access her living space through the fire escape. At 8:45 p.m., just 30 minutes after the police left, Fernando returned to Alayna's building. This time, he came prepared for war. He had armed himself with a knife and an air pistol. Fernando didn't try the front door or attempt to talk his way into the building. He went straight back to the fire escape, the same route he had used earlier. He climbed up to Alayna's 4th-floor apartment, knowing exactly where she lived, knowing exactly how to reach her. With deliberate, calculated movements, Fernando crawled through an open window into Alayna's apartment. She was trapped. Those 30 minutes between the police departure and Fernando's return represent one of the most tragic failures in domestic violence response. What happened next would become every domestic violence victim's worst nightmare and every law enforcement agency's most haunting failure. Inside her apartment, Alayna Hardy found herself face to face with the man who had terrorized her for months. What followed was a fight for survival that revealed both the depths of Fernando's brutality and the incredible courage of a young woman who refused to die without a fight. Fernando attacked with savage determination, using the knife he had brought. He stabbed Alayna 7 times, targeting her upper body with wounds that were clearly intended to kill. The attack focused on her neck and voice box, areas that would silence her cries for help and ensure maximum damage. But Fernando didn't stop at stabbing. In an act of almost animalistic rage, he bit Alayna during the assault. The small apartment became a war zone. Furniture was overturned, blood splattered the walls, and the sounds of desperate struggle echoed through the building. Neighbors heard the chaos, the thuds, the screaming, the crashing, but fear kept them frozen behind their closed doors. But here's what Fernando didn't count on. Alayna Hardy was a fighter. Even as she was being stabbed, even as she was bleeding and struggling for her life, Alayna managed to turn the tables on her attacker. Somehow, in the midst of that brutal assault, she got hold of a weapon and fought back with everything she had. Alayna stabbed Fernando in both the chest and neck, wounding him critically. Think about the strength and determination that took. A woman fighting for her life, injured and bleeding, still finding the will and the opportunity to defend herself against a man who had come to murder her. This was Alayna's final act of defiance against the man who had tried to control every aspect of her life. Even in her darkest moment, she refused to be a passive victim. She fought back with a ferocity that left Fernando critically injured and fighting for his own life. The battle raged until both combatants were severely wounded. Alayna, despite her brave resistance, had sustained injuries that were proving fatal. The 7 stab wounds, particularly those to her neck and voice box, were causing massive blood loss and compromising her ability to breathe. As the violence finally subsided, both Alayna and Fernando collapsed. The apartment fell silent except for the sound of labored breathing and the drip of blood on the floor. Neighbors, finally realizing the severity of what they had been hearing, began calling 911. But by the time emergency responders arrived, it was too late to save Alayna. She died in the ambulance on the way to Metropolitan Hospital, her life ending just minutes away from potential medical intervention that might have saved her. Fernando, critically injured from Alayna's defensive wounds, was rushed to Harlem Hospital in critical condition. The irony was devastating. The man who had come to commit murder was clinging to life in a hospital bed, while his victim was being pronounced dead in another hospital across the city. The final battle was over, but its outcome was a tragedy that would haunt everyone who knew Alayna Hardy. She had fought with extraordinary courage, had managed to wound her attacker severely, had shown that even in the face of death, she wouldn't surrender quietly. But courage and determination couldn't overcome the systematic failures that had left her alone and unprotected in that apartment. Fernando had succeeded in his ultimate act of control. If he couldn't have Alayna, no one could. The next morning, as Fernando lay unconscious in his hospital bed under police guard, he was formally charged with murder, burglary, and criminal contempt. The charges were cold, legal language that could never capture the reality of what had happened in that 4th-floor apartment. Alayna Hardy was gone, but her final battle had ensured that her killer would face justice for what he had done. The building manager who had known Alayna described her as a sweetheart. Her neighbors, who had failed to intervene during the attack, were left to live with the knowledge that a young woman's screams for help had gone unanswered just feet away from where they sat in safety. The final battle was finished, but the fight for justice was just beginning. While Fernando fought for his life in Harlem Hospital, detectives were building an ironclad case against him. The evidence was overwhelming: his fingerprints throughout Alayna's apartment, his DNA on the murder weapon, the defensive wounds on his body that perfectly matched Alayna's desperate fight for survival. Surveillance footage from the building and surrounding area captured Fernando's movements that night. His initial appearance on the fire escape, his flight when police arrived, and his return with weapons 30 minutes later. The digital trail painted a clear picture of premeditated murder. The investigation also revealed the full scope of Fernando's obsessive behavior in the months leading up to the murder, but there was no manhunt needed. Fernando survived his injuries and was formally charged the next day from his hospital bed with murder, burglary, and criminal contempt. He would spend the next 3 years awaiting trial, giving Alayna's family and friends time to process their grief while dreading the inevitable reliving of that horrible night. When the trial finally began in 2024, the courtroom was packed. Alayna's family sat in the front row, facing the man who had stolen their beloved daughter, sister, and cousin from them. Fernando, now 29 years old, looked different from the man who had terrorized Alayna. Thinner, older, wearing the defeated expression of someone who knew his fate was sealed. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorneys Daphne Yoron and Joseph Abrams, methodically presented their case. The defense had little to work with. They couldn't deny Fernando had killed Alayna. The evidence was too overwhelming. Instead, they tried to argue for a lesser charge, suggesting the murder wasn't premeditated, but rather the result of a man who had snapped under emotional pressure. But the prosecution destroyed that narrative with cold, hard facts. Fernando hadn't snapped. He had armed himself with 2 weapons, climbed a fire escape, and crawled through a window to attack a defenseless woman. That level of planning and deliberation proved premeditation beyond any reasonable doubt. The trial lasted several days, but the jury's deliberation was swift. They found Fernando guilty on all counts: murder in the second degree, burglary in the first degree, burglary in the second degree, and criminal contempt in the first degree. When the verdict was read, Alayna's family wept, not tears of joy, but tears of exhausted relief that justice had finally been served. A month later, Fernando faced sentencing. This was when Alayna's family got their chance to speak directly to the man who had destroyed their lives. Her mother rose to give a victim impact statement, her voice shaking with grief and rage. She spoke about the daughter she would never see graduate nursing school, never see get married, never see have children of her own. She described the emptiness Fernando had left in their family, the hole that could never be filled. "She was my everything," she said, looking directly at Fernando. "And you took her from us, not because of an accident, not because of illness, but because you made a choice. You chose violence. You chose murder." Then came the moment that would define Fernando's character once and for all. Given the opportunity to address the court, to show remorse, to acknowledge the pain he had caused, Fernando stood up slowly. His apology was hollow, almost mechanical. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, barely audible. "I never meant for this to happen." The words hung in the air like a lie everyone could see through. How do you accidentally arm yourself with weapons? How do you accidentally climb a fire escape? How do you accidentally stab someone 7 times? Fernando's apology was as empty as his soul, offering no real remorse, no genuine acknowledgement of the horror he had inflicted. Even in his final moment to show humanity, he failed. Judge delivered the sentence with appropriate gravity: 40 years to life in state prison. At 29 years old, Fernando would likely die behind bars, never again free to terrorize another woman. Justice had been served, but it felt incomplete. No sentence could bring Alayna back. No prison term could restore what Fernando had stolen from her family and friends. Alayna Hardy was 27 years old, studying to be a nurse, planning to help people heal. She was kind, vibrant, full of dreams and potential. She deserved to live those dreams, to graduate nursing school, to help her patients, to find real love with someone who cherished rather than controlled her. Her voice was silenced, but her story continues to speak. It tells us that the red flags are always there, that the system must do better, and that recognizing danger early can mean the difference between life and death. Listen to her story, learn from her tragedy, and never, ever ignore those red flags. They might just save your life.